All right, folks, it is the lifeblood of college football. It's recruiting season, and we are down to the nitty gritty. Less than 2 weeks to National Signing Day, and the Pac 12 in quite the recruiting battles across the West Coast and across the country, of course. So we are here with the Pac 12 breakdown. We come your way every Wednesday night at 8 o'clock on the West Coast with this week. It's pretty much the standard fare here. Don King from Last Word on Sports. Kalen Jones from House of Sparky representing Arizona State, and also Nick Dempsey from Rule of Tree and Conquest Chronicles here to break down the recruiting wars. But first, before we get to that, Nick, of course, we talked about this before we came on. Clay Helton completely revamping his staff at USC. Brady Hoke now the defensive coordinator at Oregon, which fell into place because of the Clancy Pendergast move back to USC from the NFL. So why don't you sort things out for us? And I'm sure Don's going to jump in on this one as well.
Yeah, the short answer is Clay Helton's kind of putting the old Lane Kiffin band back together. I believe it's now 5 members of Lane Kiffin's staff at USC are now on Helton's staff here for 2016, and including the defensive coordinator, Clancy Pendergast, their special teams coordinator. They just hired their old running backs coach, who was at Texas, who worked at USC under Kiffin, Helton, of course, and T. Martin. So they've got, I believe, 5 people now who worked on USC's Kiffin staff, now working for Clay Helton. Clay Helton also brought his brother in out of Western Kentucky and another coach from there as well. So it's really kind of very insular. He's bringing in basically all of the people he knows and has worked with and has trusted. So I guess right now it's really kind of looking like how you felt about Kiffin's staff, not necessarily about Kiffin's performance at USC, but how you felt about his staff and that program. Kind of starting to feel like that's how you're going to feel about Clay Helton, because it's very much the same people all back together again.
Yeah, Don, I guess if you're shooting for a #1 preseason ranking and then a Sun Bowl loss 3 months later, this is the staff to put together.
Yeah, shots fired, but the point is incredibly well taken. I don't know. It's fascinating to me. I was stunned kind of by the Helton hire anyway prior to the bowl game. You know, seriously, why not wait? Why were you in such a rush? I get that they wanted to, eliminate the distraction prior to the Pac-12 championship. Well, that didn't really work out. The bowl game, that didn't really work out. So it seemed like a bit of a lackluster move anyway, and the staff is very much back to the future. So I don't know that there's a whole bunch for, fans of the Men of Troy to get really, really fired up about, going into a date with the returning national champions, Alabama, at the start of the 2016 season. It looks daunting from the outside.
I know the Oregon part of this is kind of the sidebar, but Brady Hoke did assemble some top 15 recruiting classes at Michigan, and they're the kids that went out and won 10 games for Jim Harbaugh this year. So I don't know how much he's going to get involved there, but he did rather well in Ann Arbor. Kalen, of course, you're sitting there in Los Angeles, but an Arizona State guy. You have any thoughts about the USC situation or the Oregon Ducks?
Well, I mean, the Los Angeles situation with USC, it is interesting seeing them try to, how I alluded to in a previous show, how for younger fans like myself, this is kind of nostalgic, where you're talking about the Reggie Bush era, the Pete Carroll era, I guess you'd say. So to see him kind of reach back for that staff, I guess you could say, where they kind of came off the tail end of that, it is interesting to see whether or not it pays off. And, you'd like to see them be successful, at least I would, in a way, not against ASU, but,
Kalen, let's keep you in front of the mic here with Arizona State's recruiting situation.
Sure.
Your thoughts with it counting down to National Signing Day, where you stand? Is it if it holds tight to what it's projected to be? Is it a good class? And who are some of those guys that are on the fence that you would love to see come into the fold that could make it a much better class?
Well, I mean, obviously the decommitment of Kamari Pleasant. I mean, I guess you'd say it's a little bit disappointing, but he did play running back at Etiwanda. When you're looking at ASU's backfield right now, they do have DeMartin Richard and Kalen Ballage. So I guess I'm not too concerned about that. But looking at the entire class as a whole, it's very similar to last season's, where Again, Todd Graham brings in a top 20 recruiting class. I believe he had the same ranking in 2015 with this class. I think they're fourth in the Pac-12 as far as ranking. I think on 24/7 Sports goes by their rankings. But I think you can't put too much into this. Obviously, in Todd Graham's first year, where he actually had where the entire roster was basically everybody that he had recruited, it was definitely disappointing after he, kind of went out and said he expects his team to be a national title contending team. I wouldn't put too much into it. There's definitely some exciting players, especially like N'Keal Harry out an Arizona native. I think he's going to end up being another stud wide receiver for Arizona State, kind of in that Jalen Strong #1 receiver mold. He's very talented. He's very strong, especially after the catch. So if I was going to peg anyone as the most exciting, it's definitely him. As far as the defensive side of the ball, you need to find some more athletic corners. The guys that they're bringing in right now, I know Jamarcus Rhodes is probably their top recruit. I believe he's a 4-star guy. He's pretty talented, but I'm not surprised Todd Graham going the JUCO route. I believe he has 3 or 4, Koran Karam, Douglas Tuttle, who, again, they're trying to figure out who can play in that devil role off the edge for Arizona State as the elite pass rusher, especially in the absence. We lost another guy who got in trouble, believe it or not. He got kicked out of school for, I believe he robbed someone's credit card or some fiasco with that. So it's unfortunate, but it's definitely interesting to see what Todd Graham is able to do following a year where, again, he came in saying this is the best team that he's ever had, and the team ended up going 6-7. So, I mean, I'm not putting much stake into it, but it's definitely interesting to see.
I'm guessing that Arizona high school football is not the best, and I hope I'm not offending anyone from that territory, but I'm guessing it's not the best. California seems to supply most of the talent for the conference. Has he been there long enough for you to get a real feel for where Graham likes to go for talent?
Well, I mean, he'd like to stay in home and recruit some of the talent that's here. I mean, when you look at the Texas A&M game last year, when you see Kyle Allen and Christian Kirk, who are 2 homegrown players from Arizona, he wasn't able to get either one, and you see them end up actually, destroying Arizona State in the first game. So I definitely think the well would be home. I'm not surprised right now. He does have 5 from California, 3 from Arizona, and then one from Florida, 1 from Louisiana. Let me look at the list. Nebraska, Oklahoma, Texas has 3. So, I mean, as far as, pipeline states, I wouldn't necessarily say, like, Arizona is #1. He definitely prefer, as he should. But California, obviously, population-wise and then just talent-wise, like you pointed out, it's not surprising.
Still, at the same time, way to shoot down my claim there about Arizona football when you come back with the probably the best freshman in the SEC, and also Kyle Allen, who got off to a great start at Texas A&M before things kind of went downhill to a certain extent. All right, this is the part of the show where we give it over to Don and we give it over to Nick, and we let them just school us on Stanford recruiting. So, Don, I guess we'll lead off with you, and you can have at it here for a while.
Yeah, this is a fascinating recruiting season for Stanford and kind of an interesting offseason. So first, the good news, no significant staff turnover, which is fabulous. There was great concern that Lance Anderson might get picked off to go be the head coach at BYU. That didn't happen. They went in a different direction. Have to believe he would have been a candidate, and I'm sure he was, but they wound up going with someone else, somewhat to the relief of David Shaw and to all of Nerd Nation. So the staff stayed intact. The top of the recruiting class, for the most part, is still intact and is very strong. So it looks really good at the top. Caden Smith is kind of the crown jewel of the class, tight end out of Texas. #2 in the nation at his position in the class of 2016, 6'5.5", 235, and at 18 years old, that's really kind of horrifying. The kid's supposed to be just a beast with some good straight line speed, kind of the next Kobe Fleener, Zach Ertz type of player. Another quarterback this season after taking a year off last year, KJ Costello out of Southern California. #3 pro-style QB in the nation. That's a great get. He was a very early commit, and he stayed firm on the card. Outside linebacker Curtis Robinson from Southern California as well. Another prize recruit, probably going to have to bulk up a little to play outside linebacker in the Pac-12. could wind up being kind of a nickel corner, run stopper type. And down the list, a couple other good players at receiver, a good offensive tackle candidate, a good cornerback. But what's kind of unusual is that Stanford actually lost a recruit just earlier, this month, when Nigel Edmonds flipped from Stanford to the dreaded California Golden Bears, which just never happens. And he's a 4-star defensive back. He was indeed admitted to Stanford, so it was not an admissions office issue. He just felt Cal was a better fit and changes his verbal, and it looks to be solid, and it's expected that he'll enroll at Cal, in this fall, if not sooner. And there are a few other guys who have reopened their recruitment. No definitive word on exactly what's behind that, but this time of year, it's not completely atypical for Stanford to lose a couple of guys to the decommitment route, and typically it means admissions issues, but I'm not going to speculate on that. But that said, the Stanford class is still pretty solid. It's now a little lighter than it had been targeted. It's they're down to 16 firm commits so far now, shooting for a class of 20. It was at 18, obviously. And there are still a couple of people in the hopper who ideally would be lured to sign on to the class yet before the deadline in a couple of weeks. So, there's a 3-star wide receiver, Donald Stewart, from New Jersey, who was admitted. He's still deciding between Stanford and Michigan, ironically enough. And also Stanford's trying to flip a Texas commit who's a defensive back, Obi Ebo, trying to convince him to at least come take a look at Stanford and trying to see if his commitment can be swayed over to the West Coast. So the class looks solid. Not outstanding. It's probably rated by rivals I've seen and 24/7 as the second best class now in the Pac-12 with some of these recent decommits. It had been the number 1 class in the conference prior to that. Still could climb back up there. We'll see. One thing that's been interesting and very positive in the David Shaw era, he's tended to close stronger than any of his recent predecessors, frankly, including Jim Harbaugh, from a recruiting standpoint. So we'll see how it goes this time around. But there are some fairly significant shoes to be filled, as I'm sure you well know.
Nick, Don, and I have had the discussion many times that Stanford's not exactly the place where they get that crazy about recruiting rankings. So if they're 27th in the country, alarms aren't firing off all over the place. Your thoughts about the recruiting class at Palo Alto at this point?
There's a lot of folks, even with some of these decommits, that are saying this could be the best recruiting class in Shaw's tenure for Stanford. You're right. I don't think a lot of folks at Stanford get riled up, and I think that's partially because guys like Harbaugh and Shaw came in and they excel at coaching players up.
Yep.
Don can correct me, but I don't know if Stanford's consistently had the best recruiting class in the Pac-12, yet they've consistently won the Pac-12 3 of the last 4 years.
Yeah, that is a fact.
So, we all love to place a lot of emphasis on recruiting, and we see schools like Alabama do it very well, but Shaw has proven he doesn't need boatload. He doesn't need 25 5-star athletes every year to compete. He can do a heck of a lot more with a heck of a lot less than plenty of other coaches in this country. So I think that's probably why a lot of people don't get as excited or as fired up. Having said that, the recent couple of decommits we've seen have gotten people to pay attention. But I believe there was a running back who just decommitted earlier in the week.
Mm-hmm.
But I think not just academic, so that's normally where I'd go first, because it's not like Stanford's easy to get into. But oddly enough, there's this weird scenario that Stanford I don't think has seen for a while. At some positions, they're just a little too deep.
Right.
And if you're I believe the running back, if you're an incoming running back and you went to this big visit weekend and you saw two other running backs in your class that were better than you saw Bryce Love on your depth chart, ahead of him you saw Christian McCaffrey. You got to think, man, if I want to get to the NFL, I got to see some playing time. A Stanford degree is great and all, but I'm never going to play it down if I come here. Maybe I should think about this. I get it. Back in the day, USC had that problem with QB, and now it's come to Stanford. It's a good problem to have.
Yeah, I think you're dead on that one, Nick. And if you're a young recruit, and to your point, there are a couple of very strong running back commits in the 2016 Stanford class still. But if you're that one kid who comes and looks around and you see Barry J. Sanders planning to leave as a grad transfer student, possibly back to his dad's alma mater at Oklahoma State, you're like, good Lord, if Barry J. can't get on the field, what chance do I have? So I think you have a very solid argument there. And, and Bryce Love was electric as a freshman, figures to do more as a sophomore. And, Shaw has shown a willingness to run Christian McCaffrey until one of his legs falls off. So I think you can expect that again in the 2016 season.
Yeah. Let me throw this out for all three of you. So I'm the type of sports fan and analyst, and specifically to college football, that whether I'm living in Los Angeles, New York City, or the middle of Kansas, I'm watching the same teams, I'm watching the same games, my news comes from the same sources, it's nationally based. A lot of people just live, even in 2016 when we're all on the internet constantly, people live in their little vacuum. So it just seems from a national perspective, talking about the national media outlets and the way they cover recruiting and National Signing Day in particular, that the Pac-12 is just kind of lost out there. And it's not given anything close to the pub that the SEC in particular, number one, and then even to a lesser degree the Big Ten, the ACC, and the other conferences, despite the load of talent that comes into this conference and then 3 or 4 years later transitions to the NFL. Your thoughts?
Bingo. Yeah, I don't think there's a whole lot to add to that. You're exactly right. You would think it were a mid-October game that kicked off at 10:45 p.m. on the East Coast. People seem not to be paying that much attention to it. Yeah. And the rankings kind of reflect it as well. But I think there are going to be some really solid recruiting classes in the Pac-12, and there's going to be a lot of talent, top to bottom in the conference again in 2016. The coaches are pretty solid in the conference now, and many of them are a year deeper into their tenure and get their guys in there and start to get their programs implemented. Chris Peterson at Washington comes to mind. They made serious strides last year. That's going to be a dangerous football team this fall. And they're not the only ones. There are a lot of teams that are going to be quite a bit better.
Kaylin, how would you measure the interest in Arizona State recruiting among the fan base?
Well, the diehard fans are, because it kind of opens up my whole opinion of fans in general, which, a majority of the time it's fair weather fandom. So obviously Arizona State didn't have a good year, so there's not too much interest. But the diehard fans, from what I can tell on our website, at least in the comments and everything else, they're definitely intrigued. They want to see who Todd Graham is able to bring in and hopefully, have them produce after last season, again, making his claims and then the team kind of falling flat on its face. You bring in a new offensive coordinator in Chip Lindsey, he pretty much had an interview where he pretty much said it's the same exact system that Mike Norvell had before he left. So as far as plugging in the players, and I think that's where the intrigue comes. You're hoping that the team can improve. So it's more so the diehard fans who are into it. Again, the fair weather fans, they saw the team suck this year, for lack of a better word, and they're not going to be interested.
Don, Nick, you graduated from college 3 or 4 years ago, something in that range. So how do you guys...
You're off by a decimal point, my friend. In my case, at least, maybe not in Nick's.
How do you guys gauge the Stanford interest among the fan base and the size of the fan base today versus what it was 10 or 15 years ago or more?
Yeah, it's larger now than it was 10, 15, 20 years ago, the fan base is, and the interest is higher too. You know,
Hmm.
go to a few Rose Bowls, win a couple of them in a fairly short period of time. It'll make a difference. And not a lot of people I know are paying a lot more attention now to recruiting and so forth than they did, you know, back in the day. We hardly blinked and hardly looked at it, and just kind of counted on rising up and having that one big upset each season that we could feel great about. And then staggering to 4-7 or 5-6, or if we were really lucky 7-4 and going to a second-tier bowl game and being ecstatic. So the expectations changed and people are paying more attention, and there's a Twitter community of us now who follow this stuff and watch it and look to see who's ending their career to go off to medical school next fall, or declaring early for the draft like Austin Hooper. We pay more attention than we did back in the old days.
Hey, Nick, you've spent a lot of time in the Midwest. You've spent a lot of time on the West Coast. I don't know where else you've been, but do you see differences in the fan bases? Do you see difference in the interest levels?
Yeah, it's very, there's cultural differences, and I don't know if it's the weather or just how folks were brought up. But in Ohio, man, Buckeyes are probably the second biggest religion out here. It's a huge deal. Some of that might help that certain NFL teams in that state aren't exactly exciting. Let's put it nicely. Or you look at SEC country down south. College football is a way of life down there.
Yep.
Whereas out in California, February 4th, National Signing Day, it's nice. People go outside on that day. Not a lot of us are sitting around watching ESPN to see what a bunch of high schoolers are doing. So I get it, but it is, there is a segment of certainly USC fans that are all about it, love hearing all the latest updates. Actually will get on us if we're not quick enough with the updates on the latest recruiting news. But I think I kind of see it as like, how in the NFL draft, when people just go nuts and it's 4 days of watching the NFL draft, it's sort of a longer, more drawn out college version of the NFL draft. That's sort of what I liken it to. But it's definitely a bigger deal in Ohio, SEC country, the Midwest in general, because I think that's just college football, or maybe just football in general, is much more ingrained in the culture than maybe it is out west.
Yep.
Well, it obviously translates exactly from what's going to happen in 2 weeks on National Signing Day to what we see on the field. A lot of people consider this a crapshoot. They don't look at the recruiting rankings, don't think they mean much. And I do think that there are some outliers like what Jim Harbaugh did at Stanford and now David Shaw, Michigan State, Wisconsin. They're able to do more with less. But I think it's uncanny over time that the recruiting rankings translate to what happens on the field in competing for conference and national championships. And there have even been studies that I've seen that show the translation between the 5, the 4, the 3 stars in the translation. It's almost a perfect curve of a chart to NFL stardom and being able to make an NFL roster and have an impact at the NFL level. So the rankings mean something because we're talking about big numbers of athletes. Yes, there are particular busts and kids that are 2 stars and less that emerge and become stars. That happens, but the numbers hold true across the board typically after year to year. So I think we've done enough damage tonight, but that definitely brings to mind something we can talk about in future weeks after we get past National Signing Day, and that's how this conference, after what maybe the broad stroke view would be a little bit of a down year in 2015, how the conference projects to 2016 and getting back maybe a little bit of swagger for this fall. So for Nick Dempsey from Rule of Tree and Conquest Chronicles, also Kalen Jones from House of Sparky, and also Donald King from Last Word on Sports. Gentlemen, it's always a good time. Appreciate the insight and the information, and we will see you soon on Pac-12 Breakdown.
Have a good night, Mark.
Thanks, Mark.
Have a good one.